700 years after its construction in the 1200s, Castle Itter would see a battle between the Waffen-SS and a combined force of defecting German Wehrmacht troops, American soldiers, Austrian resistance fighters, and various French political prisoners. And given that Hitler's suicide was on the 30th of April 1945, and that the battle took place on the 5th of May 1945, with Germany officially surrendering just 2 days later on the 7th of May, the chances of such a strange battle occurring were slim, yet it happened in one of history's most improbable twists of fate that would forever cement this engagement as perhaps the most bizarre and extraordinary military action of the entire Second World War. By May 4th, 1945, Hitler had been dead for 5 days and the war in Europe was winding down, with the Allies storming towards Berlin from the west, whilst Soviet forces were looming down on Germany's capital from the east, and with the war all but over, peace was finally on the horizon. But during these dying days of World War II, when most soldiers simply wanted to survive long enough to go home, a small medieval castle nestled in the Austrian Alps became the backdrop to one of war's strangest and most unlikely battles that would bring together the most improbable coalition of fighters ever assembled on a European battlefield. Castle Itter is nestled above the Austrian village of Itter in the Tyrolean Alps, and the castle has seen its share of transformations over the centuries. Originally a medieval fortress that evolved into a 19th-century alpine retreat, the kind of place you'd imagine travelers visiting for fresh air and sweeping mountain views, with quiet mornings and the majesty of the surrounding peaks making it seem like the last place on Earth where one of history's most remarkable military engagements would unfold. Castle Itter existed as a fortress since at least the 13th century, and was rebuilt in 1532, then renovated in 1878, and became a hotel early in the 20th century. But in 1940, after the Anschluss brought Austria into the Third Reich, the castle was rented out to the German government, beginning a transformation that would turn this picturesque alpine retreat into one of the most unusual prisons in all of Nazi-occupied Europe. On February 7, 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, under the orders of Heinrich Himmler, seized the castle from its owner Franz Gruner, and by April 25th of that year, the transformation of the castle into a prison was completed, and the facility was placed under the administration of the Dachau concentration camp. But unlike Dachau itself, with its gas chambers and crematoria, Castle Itter was designated for a very specific and unusual purpose. The prison was established to contain high-profile French prisoners valuable to the Reich, and notable prisoners included tennis player Jean Barotra, former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, former Commanders-in-Chief Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, Charles de Gaulle's elder sister Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, right-wing leader and French resistance member François de la Roque, and trade union leader Léon Jouhaux, creating what amounted to a who's who of French political and military leadership, all confined within the thick stone walls of this alpine fortress. The last prisoners of Castle Itter were mostly elderly French men who had been high-ranking government officials before falling into disfavor with Vichy France or the Third Reich, including former French premiers Édouard Daladier, who had signed the Munich Agreement but was arrested in African exile, and Paul Reynaud, who had consistently opposed Germany, along with former generals Maxime Weygand, who was caught trying to flee the country in 1942, and Maurice Gamelin, who unsuccessfully resisted the German advance in spring 1940 and these men represented not just France's past but potentially its future as well, as their survival or death could dramatically impact the shape of post-war French politics and government. The prisoners occupied cells converted from hotel guest rooms and had a service staff from Dachau, and they had adequate food and were free to walk within their compound, making their captivity relatively comfortable compared to the horrors being experienced by millions in concentration camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. Yet despite these comparatively humane conditions, the prisoners understood that their value as hostages could evaporate in an instant if the Nazi regime decided they were more useful dead than alive. The French prisoners, despite sharing the same fate, were open in their animosity toward one another, as many of these men had been political rivals who blamed each other for France's defeat, and this internal tension added another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary situation, as former Prime Ministers Daladier and Reynaud, who had once competed for control of France, now found themselves imprisoned together in an Austrian castle, wondering if they would live to see liberation or die at the hands of fanatical SS troops. Among the prisoners was Jean Barotra, born on August 13, 1898 in Arbonne, France, who was a prominent French tennis player of the 1920s, nicknamed the Bounding Basque because of his quick dashes and energetic acrobatic play, and he won Wimbledon in 1924 and 1926, the Australian Championship in 1928, and the French title in 1924 and 1931, and he was victorious in numerous Grand Slam doubles and mixed doubles matches, making him not just a political figure but an international celebrity whose imprisonment added a touch of fame to the castle's already notable roster of inmates. During World War II, Barotra served as a captain in the French army and later as General Commissioner for Education and Sports in the Vichy government. But in 1942, while trying to escape to North Africa to join Allied forces, he was arrested by the Gestapo, pumped full of truth serum, and then taken to a concentration camp where he was put in solitary confinement for 6 months before the King of Sweden, Gustav V, a tennis fan and an acquaintance, intervened at the behest of Lacoste, and after this intervention, Barotra was eventually transferred to the prisoner of war camp at Itter Castle, where his athletic conditioning and competitive spirit would soon prove invaluable in ways no tennis match could have prepared him for. The castle's transformation from alpine retreat to high-security prison was overseen by guards from the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units that had earned their fearsome reputation running the concentration camp system, but these guards also relied on prisoners from Dachau to perform maintenance and menial labor at the castle. On May 3, 1945, Zvonimir Chuchkovic, an imprisoned Yugoslav communist resistance member from Croatia who worked as a handyman at the prison, left the castle under the pretext of performing an errand for the prison's commander, Sebastian Wimmer, and Chuchkovic went to seek Allied assistance, embarking on a desperate journey that would set in motion the remarkable chain of events leading to the battle. The town of Wurgel was 8 kilometers down the mountains and was occupied by German troops, and because of this, Chuchkovic instead pressed on up the Inn River Valley towards Innsbruck, 64 kilometers distant, and late that evening he reached the outskirts of the city and encountered an advance party of the 409th Infantry Regiment of the American 103rd Infantry Division of the U.S. VI Corps and informed them of the castle's prisoners, hoping that American forces would mount an immediate rescue operation. At dawn, a heavily armored rescue was mounted, but was stopped by heavy shelling just past Jenbach, around halfway to Itter, then recalled by superiors for encroaching into territory of the U.S. 36th Division to the east, and only 2 jeeps of auxiliary personnel continued, leaving the prisoners' fate uncertain and setting the stage for an even more dramatic rescue attempt. When Chuchkovich failed to return, and the former commandant of Dachau, Eduard Weiter, died in suspicious circumstances at the castle on May 2nd, the prison's commandant, Sebastian Wimmer, feared for his own life and abandoned his post, and the SS Totenkopf Verbände guards left the castle soon after, suddenly leaving the high-value French prisoners in control of the castle but unable to leave because hostile German forces, particularly fanatical Waffen-SS units, still roamed the surrounding area and would certainly execute any prisoners they encountered. Failing to learn of the result of Chuchkovich's effort, prison leaders accepted the offer of its Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, to bicycle to Virgil midday on May 4th, in hopes of reaching help there, and armed with a similar note, he succeeded in contacting Austrian resistance in Virgil, which had recently been abandoned by Wehrmacht forces but reoccupied by roaming Waffen-SS troops, and this second rescue attempt would prove far more successful than the first, though it would lead to an alliance so improbable that even those who participated in it could barely believe what was happening. Krobot was taken to Major Josef Gangl, commander of the remains of a unit of Wehrmacht soldiers who had defied an order to retreat, and instead thrown in with the local resistance led by Rupert Hagleitner, and Gangl sought to maintain his unit's position in the town to protect local residents from SS reprisals, because fanatical Nazi loyalists were shooting at any window displaying either a white flag or an Austrian flag, and were summarily executing males as possible deserters, creating a reign of terror in the final days of the war that Gangl and his men were determined to prevent. Joseph Sepp Gangl was born on September 12, 1910, in Obertraubling in the Kingdom of Bavaria, the son of an official of the Royal Bavarian State Railways and a former shop assistant, and when he was a toddler, the family moved to Peißenberg in Upper Bavaria, where Joseph's younger siblings were born, beginning a life that would eventually lead him from being a decorated Wehrmacht officer to becoming a hero of the Austrian resistance in the war's final days. Gangl was promoted to Oberfeldwebel in November 1938, and from October 1939 he was to study at an officer school of the Wehrmacht, though his regiment was stationed in the Saar-Palatinate on the border with France preparing for war, and on September 7, 1939, 11 French divisions crossed the border and advanced about 8 kilometers into German territory, which was Gangl's first combat during the Second World War, and over the following years he would serve with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts, becoming a highly decorated officer who had seen more than his share of the horrors inflicted by Nazi ideology. A decorated officer who had served on both the Eastern and Western fronts, Gangl had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime and had started aiding Austrian resistance fighters, and in the final days of the war he had used his position to protect local civilians from SS reprisals, making the decision that protecting innocent lives was more important than following orders from a regime he no longer believed in, even if that decision could cost him his life. Gangl's hopes were pinned on the Americans reaching Virgil promptly so he could surrender to them, and Nazi loyalists would shoot at any window displaying either a white flag or an Austrian flag and would summarily execute males as possible deserters, creating an atmosphere of terror that made Gangl's decision to stay and protect the town's residents an act of extraordinary courage. After speaking with Krobot, Gangl realized that his 10 to 20 loyal troops wouldn't be enough to adequately protect the prisoners at Castle Itter, and unfortunately he only had around 20 loyal men under his command, nowhere near enough to face the hundreds of SS troops patrolling the area, so Gangl made a decision that under any other circumstances would have seemed suicidal. So he grabbed a white flag and drove towards the nearest American unit in the area, and instead Gangl surrendered to nearby American forces, specifically a unit led by Captain John C. Jack Lee, Jr. of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, approaching men who just days earlier had been his enemies and hoping they would listen to his plea before they shot him. Around the same time, a reconnaissance unit of 4 Sherman tanks of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division of the U.S. XXI Corps, under the command of Lieutenant Lee, had reached Kufstein, Austria, 13 kilometers to the north, and there in the town square it idled while waiting for the 12th to be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division, with the young American officer having no idea that he was about to participate in one of the strangest military operations of the entire war. Lieutenant John C. Lee, Jr. was born on March 12, 1918, in New York, and he was a graduate of Norwich University. And Lee was the archetypal cigar-chewing, whiskey-drinking tank commander called Captain Jack by his crew, though at this point in early May 1945 he was still a first lieutenant who had fought his way across Europe with the 12th Armored Division and, like most soldiers, simply wanted to survive the war's final days and go home. The 12th Armored Division had entered combat in October 1944 and fought as part of Patton's Third Army, holding the line while the rest of the Third Army moved to recapture Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and fighting at the Colmar Pocket, giving Lee and his men extensive combat experience that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. When Gangl sought out Captain Jack Lee, a tank commander in the U.S. 12th Armored Division, it must have been a tense moment with Gangl, a former enemy, approaching with a white flag, hoping the Americans wouldn't shoot first and ask questions later. But to Lee's credit, he listened as Gangl explained the situation. And despite the extraordinary nature of what he was hearing, a German officer asking for help to rescue French prisoners from other Germans, Lee recognized the urgency and humanity of the situation. Asked to provide relief by Gangl, Lee did not hesitate, volunteering to lead the rescue mission and immediately earning permission from his headquarters, and recognizing the urgency of the situation, Lee accepted both the surrender and the plan, making a split-second decision that would define the rest of his life and create one of the most remarkable episodes in American military history. After a personal reconnaissance of the castle with Gangl and Hagleitner in the Major's Kubelwagen, Lee left 2 of his tanks behind but requisitioned 5 more, and supporting infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. And together they gathered a small but determined force made up of a mix of U.S. troops, defected Wehrmacht soldiers, and members of the Austrian resistance, creating what was perhaps the most unique military formation of World War II, an alliance that days earlier would have been unthinkable but now represented the best hope for the prisoners trapped in Castle Itter. En route, Lee was forced to send the reinforcements back when a bridge proved too flimsy for the entire group to cross once, let alone twice, and leaving one of his tanks behind to guard it, he set back off, accompanied only by 14 American soldiers. Gangl, a driver, and a truck carrying 10 former German artillerymen, dramatically reducing the size of his force, but recognizing that speed and surprise might be more valuable than overwhelming numbers in this desperate race against time. 6 kilometers from the castle, they defeated a party of SS troops that had been attempting to set up a roadblock. And as Lee, Gangel, and their ragtag team approached, they encountered SS forces attempting to set up roadblocks, but the combined U.S. Wehrmacht force was able to break through and press on, with every man in this unlikely joint operation opening fire at the SS troops and forcing them to withdraw into the surrounding woods, demonstrating that despite their differences, these American and German soldiers could work together effectively when facing a common enemy. Meanwhile, back at Castle Itter, the French prisoners had asked an SS officer, Kurt Siegfried Schrader, whom they had befriended in Itter during his convalescence from wounds and who was living locally, to take charge of their defense. And Schrader would also situate his family within the castle to protect them as well as the French POWs, adding yet another layer of improbability to this already extraordinary situation, as a Waffen-SS officer prepared to defend French prisoners against his former comrades. When Lee arrived at the castle, prisoners greeted the rescuing force warmly but were disappointed with its small size, having hoped for a much larger American force and feeling uncertain about whether such a small group could hold off a determined SS attack. Lee placed the men under his command in defensive positions around the castle and positioned his Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, at the main entrance. And arriving at the castle, Lee and Gangel found the prisoners already armed and prepared for the worst, with the old politicians and generals who had once commanded armies now reduced to manning rifles and preparing to fight for their lives in a medieval castle. Inside the castle, the prisoners had armed themselves with whatever they could find, and Jean Borotra, the French tennis star, had taken charge of organizing them, though most were untrained in combat, applying the same competitive drive and organizational skills that had made him a champion on the tennis courts to the deadly serious task of preparing for battle. Shortly after the arrival of the reinforcements, a force of 100 to 150 Waffen-SS soldiers led by Oberfuhrer Georg Bochmann, who had been occupying some hills near the town, decided to attack the castle, and Lee had ordered the French prisoners to hide, but they remained outside and fought alongside the American and Wehrmacht soldiers, with these elderly French politicians and military leaders refusing to cower in safety while others fought to defend them, instead taking up arms themselves in a display of courage that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Throughout the night, the defenders were harried by a reconnaissance force sent to assess their strength and probe the fortress for weaknesses, and before the main assault began, Gangel was able to phone Alois Mayer, the Austrian resistance leader in Virgil, and ask for reinforcements, but the resources available were pitifully small compared to the SS force that would soon launch its attack. Only 2 more German soldiers under his command and a teenage Austrian resistance member, Hans Waltel, could be spared, and they quickly drove to the castle, bringing the total defending force to barely more than 24 men, facing an SS assault force of well over 100 fanatical troops who would show no mercy if they broke through the castle's defenses. In the morning of May 5th, the attack began, and the castle shook from machine gun fire and anti-aircraft shells to such an extent that some bricks began to collapse, one hitting and injuring Schrader's wife, with the ferocity of the SS assault immediately making clear that this was going to be a desperate fight for survival. Lee's tank, Besotten Jenny, provided support until it was destroyed by German fire from an 88mm gun, and machine gun fire rained down on the castle, and the SS deployed a formidable 88mm flak cannon, eliminating the defenders' most powerful weapon and leaving them to rely on small arms and their determination to hold off an enemy that outnumbered them 5 or 6 to 1. The defenders, American GIs, Wehrmacht defectors, and French prisoners fought side by side, and meanwhile the fighting was fierce, with Lee's tank Besotten Jenny hit by the 88mm gun, taking it out of the fight as Americans scrambled to pull the crew out, demonstrating the intensity of the battle as SS troops pressed their attack from multiple directions, trying to find a weakness in the castle's defenses. The French officials who hadn't yet taken up arms soon did, although not all of them had the best skill with an MP40. But the SS continued on, and even with their solid arsenal of weapons, the defenders were soon low on ammo, with the situation becoming increasingly desperate as the hours wore on and ammunition supplies dwindled, while the SS showed no signs of breaking off their attack. Gangl, ever the protector, was killed by a sniper while trying to shield one of the French leaders from harm, and as the German major attempted to move Paul Reynaud out of harm's way, he was shot and killed by an SS sniper, and with this single shot the battle claimed its only fatality among the defenders, as the man who had risked everything to protect civilians and prisoners from his own regime paid the ultimate price for his courage and humanity. Gangl died from a sniper's bullet, saving the life of Paul Reynaud, who had been the Prime Minister of France during the Battle of France, which was where Gangl had first seen combat 5.5 years previously, creating a poignant symmetry as the German officer who had fought against France in 1940 now died protecting a French leader, demonstrating how the war had transformed not just nations but individual men in ways no one could have predicted. With Gangl dead and ammunition nearly exhausted, Lee began pulling the defenders off the walls and deeper into the keep as he saw a squad of Waffen-SS close to the gatehouse. And just as they brought a Panzerfaust into position, Lee began pulling his troops off the walls and into the keep, even as the SS scented blood and rushed forward. And the Nazis began rolling up one of their cannon to fire directly at the doors of the castle, which was the final defense for Itter's defenders, and it appeared that the castle would fall within minutes and all the defenders would be killed or captured. By early afternoon, the 142nd had received the call for reinforcements, and a relief force was dispatched. And aware that he had been unable to give the 142nd complete information on the enemy and its disposition before communications had been severed, Lee accepted Tennistar Borotra's offer to vault the castle wall and run the gauntlet of SS strongpoints and ambushes to deliver it. And this is when Jean Borotra's years of athletic training and competitive spirit would be put to their ultimate test. Just as it seemed that all hope was lost, one of the prisoners, Borotra, the French tennis legend, offered to undertake a suicidal mission in order to save those trapped in the castle, offering to slip out of the castle, find American reinforcements, and direct them back to the castle in order to save the prisoners and the American and German soldiers. And as the situation grew desperate, Borotra volunteered for a daring mission, a feat that would require him to escape from a castle under siege, evade SS troops in the surrounding area, and somehow make contact with American forces before the castle fell. When there was a lull in the fire coming from the attacking Germans, Borotra, disguised as an Austrian peasant, slipped out of the castle and made his way to Virgil, where there were still American soldiers. And, fortunately for those trapped in the castle, Borotra was still in extremely good shape from his tennis career and managed to outrun several SS soldiers on his way to Virgil, using the same speed and agility that had made him a champion tennis player to dodge enemy fire and sprint through terrain where one misstep could have meant capture and execution. The tennis star was recognized by René Lévesque, a French-Canadian reporter embedded with the 142nd and later Premier of Quebec, and Borotra asked for an American military uniform, then joined the force as it made haste to reach the prison before its defenders fired their last rounds of ammunition. And when Borotra discovered an American battalion, he managed to redirect them back to the castle, knowing where all the German roadblocks were on his way and able to guide the relief force around these obstacles. Then a shout went out from the SS, Amerikanische Panzer, meaning American tanks. And Lee and his men, German, French, and American black and white, cheered as the SS faded into the woods and Boche Buster rolled up at the head of a long column of tanks and trucks, and the day was saved just moments before the SS would have breached the castle's final defenses. The relief force arrived around 1600 hours, and the SS were promptly defeated, and some 100 SS prisoners were reportedly taken. And although the Battle of Castle Itter may appear as simply an interesting, strange event, it may well have greatly impacted the trajectory of post-war France, because the prisoners who were saved would go on to play crucial roles in shaping France's recovery and its approach to European integration in the decades following the war. The French prisoners were evacuated to France that evening, reaching Paris on May 10th, finally free after years of captivity and ready to participate in rebuilding their nation. Gangel died during the battle from a 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser round while trying to move former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud out of harm's way, and was honored as an Austrian national hero. And a street in Vergel was named after him, and he was the sole defender to die during the battle, though 4 others were wounded, making him a symbol of the moral courage that allowed some German soldiers to reject Nazi ideology even at the cost of their lives. For his service defending the castle, Lee was promoted to captain and received the Distinguished Service Cross. And Captain Lee's intrepid actions, personal bravery, and zealous devotion to duty exemplify the highest traditions of the military forces of the United States and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. Recognition that his willingness to trust a former enemy and lead this unprecedented joint operation represented the best values of American military leadership. Lee attended Norwich during the tense period of 1938 to 1942 and was a star of the football team, and by the time he graduated, nearly all of his classmates were headed off to war. And still a young man, he went on to play for the New York Giants football team in the late 1940s, and also coached the Sydney Cardinals, a now defunct team in upstate New York, returning to a normal life after experiencing one of the war's most extraordinary episodes. Lee died in 1973, taking with him memories of a battle that seemed too improbable to be real yet had actually happened. Kurt Siegfried Schrader received a 2-year sentence after he was arrested and charged by U.S. forces for his former affiliation with the Nazi Party, but his sentence was shortened in respect to his efforts at Itter, and he died in 1995, having earned a measure of redemption for his actions in defending the prisoners against his former comrades. Popular accounts of the battle have dubbed it the strangest battle of World War II, and the battle was fought 5 days after Adolf Hitler had committed suicide and only 2 days before the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender, and it is thought to be the only time that Americans and Germans fought as allies during World War II, making it a unique moment in military history, when the fog of war lifted just enough for men on both sides to recognize their common humanity and work together against fanatical forces that represented the worst of Nazi ideology. Not only was the battle for Castle Itter one of the most incredible, remarkable, and improbable events of the entire Second World War, it was also a pivotal moment in history. And if the SS had managed to get into the castle and kill all these French VIPs, the history of post-war France would have been radically different, said Stephen Harding, the author of the 2013 book The Last Battle, which retells the story of this unusual battle, because these prisoners would go on to formulate the policies that carried France into the 21st century. Édouard Daladier, Prime Minister at the outbreak of World War II, and Paul Reynaud, who succeeded him, were key figures in France's pre-war and early war governments, and their experiences and perspectives would heavily influence France's post-war policies and its approach to European integration, and even in the military. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, both former commanders-in-chief of the French army, would contribute greatly to the reassessment of France's military doctrine post-war, demonstrating that the battle's significance extended far beyond the immediate drama of the fighting itself. The Battle of Castle Itter is more than a bizarre historical event. It's a stark reminder of how humanity can emerge in even the darkest moments of war. And when you think about it, American soldiers and disillusioned Germans, once fierce adversaries, joining forces to defend French prisoners, and for a few hours all the labels, enemy, ally, prisoner, faded, leaving behind something simpler and more profound, the will to survive together. And when we reflect on this story, it's the humanity that stands out, because war often draws hard lines between people, but this battle reminds us that those lines aren't as immovable as they seem. The Battle of Castle Itter stands as a testament to the idea that even in the midst of total war, even in the final spasms of a conflict that had killed tens of millions and destroyed entire nations, individual human beings could still make choices based on decency, courage, and a recognition that some principles transcend nationality and politics. Joseph Gangle could have followed orders, retreated with his unit, and survived the war, but instead he chose to protect civilians and prisoners, paying for that choice with his life but earning immortality as a hero. Jack Lee could have waited for orders, played it safe in the war's final days, and avoided risk, but instead he trusted a former enemy and led his men into a desperate situation where one wrong decision could have cost dozens of lives. Jean Borotra could have stayed behind the castle walls and let younger men take the risks, but instead the middle-aged tennis champion sprinted through enemy fire to save his fellow prisoners. The French prisoners themselves could have cowered in the keep while others fought, but instead these elderly politicians and generals picked up weapons and stood alongside American GIs and German Wehrmacht soldiers in one of history's most improbable defensive stands. And perhaps most remarkably, Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an SS officer who had every reason to remain loyal to the Nazi regime, chose instead to defend French prisoners against his former comrades, recognizing that the cause he had once believed in had become monstrous beyond redemption. These choices, made by individuals in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, transformed what could have been just another minor skirmish in the war's closing days into something far more significant, a demonstration that humanity could prevail even in circumstances specifically designed to destroy it. The Battle of Castle Itter reminds us that history is not just made by great leaders and grand armies, but by individual human beings making moral choices in impossible situations, and that even in the darkest chapters of human history there are moments of light that shine all the brighter for the darkness that surrounds them. Today, Castle Itter stands as a private residence not open to the public, and there is no grand monument to mark the site of this extraordinary battle. But perhaps the castle itself serves as monument enough, a medieval fortress in the Austrian Alps where, for one brief moment in May 1945, men who should have been enemies became allies, men who had been captors and captives fought side by side, and the values of courage, honor, and human decency proved stronger than ideology, nationalism, or the vast machinery of total war that had consumed the world for 6 long years. The story of Castle Itter is ultimately a story about what happens when individuals refuse to accept that war must dehumanize everyone it touches, when soldiers choose to see former enemies as potential allies rather than perpetual threats, and when the simple recognition of shared humanity becomes more powerful than all the propaganda, indoctrination, and hatred that nations at war pour into their citizens. It's a story that deserves to be remembered not just because it was strange or improbable, but because it demonstrates truths about human nature that remain relevant today, that people can change, that redemption is possible even in the most unlikely circumstances, that courage takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for territory or resources or national interest, but simply for the principle that innocent lives are worth defending regardless of whose uniform you wear or which flag you salute.